Hey guys, it's Kevin with my review for the latest new limited series from HBO Max, of course being Station 11. And this show, we focus on, coincidentally, another pandemic, but this is a much more severe flu pandemic that is so bad it ends up collapsing all of civilization. And 20 years later, we mainly focus on this character, Kirsten. She is involved in this theater troupe known as the Traveling Symphony. That is basically this group that goes all across the world, or as they call it, the wheel, to instill hope within, the community and things like that. And eventually, they come across this violent cult that has this leader that may possibly also be connected to Kirsten's past, and in doing so, she kind of finds herself caught in the middle of what to really do with this cult that could potentially destroy everything that they've worked for, while also uncovering some of her painful memories of how she's really gotten here. So, Station 11, nobody's really talking about this show, and that's understandable to see why. Obviously, we've seen it before. When you have a show that's centered around a pandemic, during a pandemic, audiences really are not that interested. I can understand why the premise is immediately going to turn a lot of people off. And myself included, when I first heard about the show, I was like, wow, this is very timely, but not really in a way that I think is needed. I'm not really sure if this show is something that we need right now. I didn't really know how this show was really going to turn out, but I saw the talent that was involved. I saw it was going to be on HBO Max, and you know what? The more it got closer to it, the more interested I really did become, because here's the thing. We've had a lot of movies centered specifically around COVID, and most of them, if not all of them, have just not been very good at all, because they have not done a very good job of, representing the times. They feel dated like the second they come out, because they're representing different stages of COVID that isn't really relevant to what we're dealing with anymore. But this show is a completely different pandemic, a disease that isn't out there right now, and there's a lot more you can really do with that, focus on the devastation and things like that. I really didn't know how this show was going to turn out, but I assumed it was going to be a very depressing watch. But I figured that, it was wrapping up its first season. I finally decided to check it out. I actually finished this show in just a couple of days, which is a lot quicker than I do most shows. But what especially drew me to this show is, as it was going on, I saw a lot of people comparing it to that of The Leftovers, or at least something in that ilk. And you guys know, the second anyone mentions The Leftovers, my ears perk up a ton, because that is my favorite show of all time. There's no piece of television, or just hell, art in general, that has connected with me, that has moved me, that has left an impact on me in the way that show has. It was such a philosophical and emotional piece of television that I could talk about literally for hours, and I did. I mean, most of my reviews for season 3 are like 50-ish minutes long for a reason. And so knowing that especially had me very interested. And so it really is no secret. It really is no surprise, I think, when I say that Station 11 absolutely floored me in the way that this show ended up going. I think this is one of the most moving and insightful pieces of television that I've seen in quite a bit, but also a lot more hopeful and uplifting than you really would expect for it to be. And without a doubt is one of my favorite shows all of last year, or 2022, however you really do want to count it. But we are just getting into right now, starting off with the cast here. And that's absolutely one of the best things of this entire show. I think everyone in this cast really does kill it. You can tell how much they commit themselves to this material. You can see how much they really care about these characters, and I think everyone really does an amazing job. Let's first talk about the star of the show, though, in Mackenzie Davis, who I've always been a big fan of, going all the way back to, like, *Halt and Catch Fire*. I always knew that she was this very likable and charismatic actress, but here I think she gives one of her best performances yet as the character of Kirsten, who's very complex. She's been through a lot, obviously, throughout the time of the apocalypse of sorts, the collapse of civilization. She's had a bit of a traumatic past, and because of that, she's kind of had to fend for herself, but she also has this optimism to her that really has never gone away. Her passion for art and things like that is really just something you really do latch onto, and I think that's something that Davis does a really great job with, especially when I would say the latter half of the season. I think she really does kill it here. You feel so drawn to Kirsten, you want to know more about her, and I think that she does a really great job. But she's also very cautious and very much keeps her cards to her chest in that way because of what she's seen as a kid. And I think that's something that Davis represents very well when contrasting that with the way Matilda Lawler plays this character. You know, it never really feels like we're watching two separate characters. It feels like they both very much did coexist. The older Kirsten is wiser and fiercer, and she's not nearly as hopeful as young Kirsten, but young Kirsten still has that strong sort of intelligence, and she still has that passion that older Kirsten has. And I think that's something that Matilda Lawler does a really great job with. She has this innocence to her as well that you just really latch onto, and I thought both of these actresses did a really great job in this role. I think Kirsten as a character is someone, like I said, a lot of people are really going to relate to. I think if this situation were to happen, a lot of us are probably going to act like Kirsten in that way, but not quite in the way that she does. Again, the optimism that she has and things like that is something that really draws you to her character, and I think overall she does a really strong job here, and overall is a really excellent lead in this show. However, easily for me, I think the best performance of this entire show comes from Himesh Patel, who plays the character of Jeevan, and oh my god, did he blow me away here, because, look, I've seen him in other things like Yesterday and Don't Look Up, and he's given pretty solid performances in both of those, but here, I think he really does show his true acting abilities. Jeevan is a character that is the complete opposite of Kirsten. He doesn't have a lot of hope in his life. He doesn't really have a lot going for him. But through meeting Kirsten, he really does, his life kind of does change forever, and we really do see Jeevan go through, I think, the biggest arc out of any character, and I really love what they ended up doing with him here. He's a character that you want to root for, you want to hope he's always going to make the best decision, but you're not really sure if he's the guy to really, like, step up and help out everyone, even though you can tell he wants to do that. Does he really have the means to do it? I think that's something that Patel examines so well when it comes to his character. Is he doing this for selfish or selfless reasons? I think that's something that is just played into so well when it comes to Patel as a character. When it comes to Jeevan as a character, I loved what he ended up doing here. I think he gave such a strong emotional performance, and he really was the character where every time we came back to him, you know, I wanted to know more. I wanted to see, you know, we kind of start out the show with him in that way, and I thought overall he just did such an amazing job here. I think, like I said, he's someone that a lot of people are really going to find themselves latching onto, and I really did love what he ended up doing in the show. He was just absolutely phenomenal here. The places that he goes emotionally, it's absolutely the kind of performance that deserves Emmy attention. I don't think it's going to get it, but I really do hope that somehow there is a way for Patel to get a nomination for this role, because I think he absolutely is warrants one in this show, but we'll really just have to see. But I think, you know, by all accounts, no matter what, this is such a amazing performance from him, and I love what he ended up doing here. And the bond between him and Kirsten is easily the most endearing of the entire show. It's really the thing I think viewers are going to latch onto the most, is this sort of surrogate father that he becomes towards her. I really love the back and forth between these two. I think they have really solid chemistry, and I think overall that's something that is a constant in this show, that I think even if you don't like this show, I think that's something you are going to mostly gravitate towards, because really at the end of the day, these two are the heart and soul of the show. They're the thing that you want to know more about. You want to see more of that relationship, and I think overall both actors just did such a phenomenal job here. But the rest of the cast also, I think, is really great. Someone who I was honestly very impressed by is Danielle Zovatto, who plays this character, Daniel. I can't really get more into him than that, but he's this very mysterious character that Kirsten comes across, and where they ended up going with him, I was very much pleased by, and I think Zovatto did such a great job playing a role that honestly could have been very one-note, but he adds this bit of complexity to this character that really does latch you onto, Daniel as a character, and I really loved what he ended up doing within the show. I think he was just such a consistent standout for me. David Wilmot is very good as the character of Clark. He is someone who basically his entire future has kind of just like gone away, and he's kind of trying to repurpose himself, trying to re-explore, what he really needs to do, and builds up this whole other community. And I really loved what he ended up doing in this show. Nabhaan Rizwan's really great as Frank Chowdhury, who is Jeevan's brother. I think he's someone that a lot of people are really going to love. Philippa Vigue, I've never seen her before, but Alex is a character I really liked. I'll get more into her with the writing, but I really liked her in this show a lot. Lori Petty obviously is great. She's a phenomenal actress. But even some of the smaller roles, I would say, like David Cross shows up for an episode, and he is fantastic in this show. Gael Garcia Bernal is always great, and that continues to be the case here. But the other big standout for me in this show is absolutely from Danielle Deadwyler, who plays the character Miranda Carroll. I don't want to say too much of who this character is and what she's associated with, but this is someone who is very integral in the show. There's a lot that this character has gone through, and Deadwyler just nails every second of it. You understand, why this character makes the decisions that she does, her connection to the world, and everything like that. And I just really loved what she ended up doing within the show. I think this is the kind of performance that very much is kind of like that breakthrough performance. I know she had The Harder They Fall earlier, but for me, this is the performance that really makes her stick out as an actress to me. I will definitely be watching Deadwyler for a while moving forward. I think she is such a phenomenal actress, and I really did love what she ended up doing when it comes to this character. This entire cast, everyone just really kills it. I don't think there's a single false performance in the bunch. I don't think there's a weak link in this entire cast, and I think just this cast, they capture the passion, they capture that emotion that that emotional heft that all of these roles really do need. It's very hard to make a show like this work, and I think overall everyone just really rose to the occasion here. I was very impressed by everyone here. Okay, but now let's get to the directing and the writing with the show, which that's the thing I think that's going to surprise a lot of people, because the way that Patrick Somerville decides to go about this show is way different than what you would expect going into this, because when you hear about a show like Station 11, obviously, you're not going to be, you're going to expect something that's probably a very depressing watch. It's a bunch of humanity is gone wiped out by this pandemic, and, all these characters are kind of struggling on how to go on, how to really make a life. But Somerville wants to focus a lot more on the idea that life can go on and we can move forward. And I really do love that. This show's actually a lot more hopeful than you really would expect it to be, and I think the show is a lot better because of that, because of what it's really trying to say. And I think that's something that Somerville just does a really amazing job with. Even in the show's darkest moments, there remains this sense of there remains this sense of triumph. There remains this sense of optimism that we can move forward, that things are going to get better for these characters. And I really like that ambitious sort of feel that the show really does have. It makes it a lot more inviting, and also I think a lot more digestible for a lot of people. And I think that's something that he did a really good job with, but in no way does he try to underplay the darkness that's going on here. There are a lot of dark moments in the show. There are a lot of moments that are very emotional, and those moments are very much given the time that they deserve, but there's just as much hope and also a lot of comedy in the show. The show's actually very funny at points as there are tragic moments, and I think that's something that he blended very well together. I think you could see how much Somerville really cared about this story, and in a way you can kind of use Station 11 as this sense of faith that things are going to get better. There is that light at the end of the tunnel, and I think that's something that Somerville overall does a really great job with directing wise. But getting into the writing here, it's very hard to talk about this show without delving more into spoilers, but I'm going to try to do the best I can to skirt around them. What I will say is that the way this show is presented, I think, is going to maybe bother some people because it can be very disjointed at points, seemingly. The first episode of the show is pretty much we're seeing the beginnings of this pandemic, how it all started. We're seeing the character of Jeevan and him having to raise Kirsten and things like that, and him having to get her her through this situation because she really doesn't have anyone else to really depend upon, and he kind of like takes it upon himself to be the one to help her get through this in that way. And then the second episode, we suddenly are 20 years later, 20 years after the pandemic. We focus more on Kirsten and this theater troupe and kind of like what their whole mission is. And again, not for me, but I can see some people getting a bit frustrated by that storytelling because you're so latched onto a part of what's going on that you want to know more. And in that way, it is very similar to The Leftovers, where it is jumping around a lot. But what I think The Leftovers did that this show doesn't do is that The Leftovers, I think, was pretty clear from the beginning where certain pieces of the puzzle were going. They left a lot of things open in this show, and this show does too, but it does it in a more subtler manner. And again, I think that's going to frustrate some audiences, but for me, I found this show so riveting because I constantly wanted to know more. I wanted to know how certain characters that pop up throughout the show, how they really are a part of all this, what their connection to everything really is, and I think that's something the show does eventually get into very well. All of these characters, they do have something in common, even if it seems like we're focusing on a bunch of characters and the story is kind of just going in circles. I think overall, they do a really great job with that. Take the character of Clark, for example. This is someone who, his best friend, Arthur Leander, the first scene of this show is his best friend dying on stage as King Lear. And he had an interesting sort of friendship with him, and he's kind of like looking back and trying to like figure out his purpose within the world. He never really felt like he accomplished much in life, and he wants to kind of begin again, and you see how he kind of takes this opportunity to change things up. And I really liked that about Clark as a character. I think that's someone that a lot of people are going to like in this show. As I said before, I think Kirsten is a very interesting character as well, because, and especially when it comes to the theater troupe, everyone else within the theater troupe seems to have this sense of optimism. They're very low-key about what they do. Not a lot seems to worry them. They go through life pretty much unscathed. But Kirsten always has this fear. She always has this drive that something bad is going to happen, that this could be temporary, that someone else is out there. And as we get further into the flashbacks, we start to put those pieces together as to why Kirsten does act this way. Why is she so quick to jump to certain conclusions that she does in this show? And I think that's something that they overall do a really excellent job with here. So I think that's a character that you really do latch onto. But contrasting her with, say, the character of Alex, who's the complete opposite of her. Alex is someone who she's known as, while Kirsten's known as a pre-pan, Alex came during the pandemic. And so she doesn't know any of the life of, any of what the life used to be. Technology and things like that are pretty much rendered useless in that way, and it's very interesting to watch her character sort of navigate through this environment and kind of be treated like this kid constantly that she's not. And I really enjoyed what they ended up doing with her character. I think she's someone that I very much did find myself attached to. But it all does eventually circle back to Jeevan, character that we meet in the first episode, who's seemingly our main character, but really then it does become Kirsten. He's very much the backbone of the show, I feel like, in terms of heart and things like that. Because, again, he's the guy that we want to be. He wants to try to save everyone. He wants to try to turn everything around. He's had these warning signs for a while that the pandemic was going to happen. And, you see him really kind of spring into action, even if he doesn't really have the means to do so. He's really someone that does change in a pretty big way after this pandemic has happened, after things, did start to deteriorate, after the world really does undergo this shift. You really do see Jeevan transform in a pretty big way, and I really love the way the show does dive deeper into it. But again, I do want to reiterate, the show does jump around frequently. So while you might, and I actually like that a lot, because you get attached to a storyline, and then suddenly the show's moving on to something else in the next episode, but it does all come together. It does all connect in a way, and I think there's a lot of subtle nuances and things like that that are very well done here. Now, a lot of the time in the show, it does not divert quite as often as, say, The Leftovers did. Most of the time, we are focusing on either Kirsten or Jeevan, but there are some episodes where suddenly we're focusing on the character of Miranda Carroll, and we don't really know how she connects to all of this. But we're so drawn into her story, at least for me, that I didn't really care. I was like, oh my god, this is such an interesting character when we see what she's been through and what's really caused her to become the way that she has. I think that's something the show does a really great job with. Or we're focusing on this character of Clark and sort of his connection to everything. As I said, I think that's something the show dives into very well. Or we have this very mysterious character of Daniel, who is this guy that Kirsten comes across that wants to join the Traveling Symphony, and he's very mysterious. You don't really know what his agenda is. You're kind of fearful of what he's really all about, but the show really does make a considerable effort to dive deeper into all of these characters, show what really does affect them, show why they are, why they are a part of this, how they really do move on, and I really did love the way the show did dive deeper into all of that. I think that's something they did an amazing job with overall, is really, again, find a way to put all of these seemingly unrelated stories together in a very impactful way, and I really did love that. What I think all these characters at the end of the day do have in common is the idea of art, and that's something I can't really say too much about, but all of these characters are connected to art in a different way. I think a lot of what this show is trying to do is show how art is something that really can move us all. It can bring a community together, it can heal a community, and that's very much what this show is trying to say, is that, the Traveling Symphony and things like that, a lot of these characters are very much hurting in that way, understandably, because of, losses that they've had, whether it be actual losses, people they were close to, whether it be something they wanted to accomplish that they weren't able to do. All of these characters are going through this pandemic in a different way. All of them are experiencing, this sense of loss in a different way, but it's that art that they consume that really does bring everyone together, and I really did love the way this show tried to communicate in that. It's very different, like I said, from a lot of shows you've seen that deal with this. This is not this ultra dark and hopeless show. No, this is a show that really is trying to bring up the idea that we can move forward, that there is a life that is, livable. There is something that is beyond this. It is possible to move forward from this. It never will be, uninhabitable in that way. And I really love that about this show. I think that's something that we don't really think about. You think when something like this happens that everything's over and that there's no way to rebuild, but this show wants to tell you that yes, it is possible to do that, and maybe you can even become a better version of yourself in that way. I think all of those ideas are so well fleshed out here and are done in a way that I really wasn't expecting. Some of these storylines, I was not expecting them to go in the directions that they do, but it really does work very well. Even when you think this show is going in a darker direction, they find a way to kind of turn it on its head, and I think the show is that much better because of it. Like I said, that optimism the show has, it never really does go away, and I think that's something that overall is so well done when it comes to the writing here. The show can be very hard to watch at points, obviously, because of the subject matter going on here, and there were many moments that did have me tearing up in a pretty big way, but again, it's not really about the tragedy of that. It's about how do we move past that tragedy, and I think that's what really makes the show stick out to me, even when it comes to some of the characters in this show that are going through insurmountable circumstances. The show tries to tell you that maybe it isn't as hopeless as it looks for this character, and I really did like that. Even if there's a small glimmer of hope, I think that's something that is, again, really going to latch people onto the show, even if it alienates them early on. I think if the more you stick around and you realize what this show's really trying to do, I think that's something that is really going to keep you invested overall. But I also want to reiterate, this show actually is very funny at points, which I wasn't expecting. A lot of that does come from the Traveling Symphony. They don't take themselves very seriously. They're very much meant to just be this fun theater troupe. They have a very strict code of conduct, but they don't do it because they're worried about anything. They do it because they want to entertain the world. They're always moving. They never leave the wheel, as they always say, and that's something you are very much sort of caught off guard by, because the first episode, like I said, is very serious. It is very emotional. So getting more into this sort of silly nature with the Traveling Symphony, it might throw some people off, but I found it to be a very inviting one, because it's not, what we usually see when it comes to something like this. Usually when you have something like this that is this world-ending disaster, it leads to like zombie apocalypses or shortage of food, shortage of water, but this show doesn't really want to dwell on that. This show wants to focus on what can we do to move forward? What are the things that are positive about this experience that maybe we take for granted? And I think, what it really does come down to is that art that we do consume. That is something that never goes away as long as people continue to tell stories, as long as people continue to make an effort to, showcase different art within the world. That's the thing that really is going to bring a community together, and I think that's something that is really beautiful about this show overall. Now, that being said, the show in no way tries to hold back, just how strenuous and just how traumatic a lot of the pandemic is for these characters. I mean, the first episode, there is an amazing scene with a hospital and just how quickly overridden it becomes, and it feels eeringly similar to what we have been through. Obviously, in the show, it's much more devastating in that way. With how many casualties and things like that there are. But I really did like the way the show, dive deeper into those things. But again, the show just doesn't want to dwell on it too much. It shows you it because obviously it has to, and it presents it in a very effective and realistic manner, but it doesn't want to harp too much on, the sadder elements of the pandemic. It wants to focus more on the hopeful elements, and I think that's something that the show overall did a really good job with here. The cinematography of the show, I think, is also really well done. There's a great contrast between the flashbacks and the present day. The flashbacks are a lot darker. They are a lot more muted in terms of color and things like that, while the present day are, most of the time, it's very glossy, it's very colorful, and I really did like that a lot. It kind of shows the differences of the world from the mundanity to something that is a lot more unusual, but also a lot more inviting in that way. And I really did love that when it comes to the cinematography. There are some shots in the show that are just absolutely stunning to look at, and I think they really do place you into that environment very well. You kind of do want to be a part of the Traveling Symphony. You want to be a part of this world, even if it's something that you don't want to think about. You're kind of like, yeah, I could live here, and I think that's something that they overall did a really excellent job with in this show. Obviously, it's not going to be easy, but, it has this sort of inviting quality to it, similar to how the Traveling Symphony are very inviting, and I really love that when it came to the look and feel of this show. I think the cinematography in general is just such a mastercraft in that way, but also Dan Romer's score. I mean, I've talked about him as a composer before, but I think he's honestly very overlooked. I think he's done a lot of films, but I don't think a lot of people really talk about his scores. They don't talk, like Wendy, for example, a very forgettable movie, but amazing score. Luca last year, I thought he did a great job composing that score, and here, once again, he does such an amazing job of, again, representing the hope that this show wants to have. Yeah, the show can be very dark, but and even at points it can feel a bit melancholy, but throughout all of it, there is this sense of, hope, and I really did love what he did when it comes to the music in this show. It's a score that I will definitely be listening to a lot more after the show has concluded, long after the show has finished, and I really loved what he ended up doing with the score here and the editing. The show is 10 episodes long, and Again, I think for some people, they might wonder, how is this all going to wrap up in the end? Is 10 episodes really enough to tell this story? And I myself was questioning that a few points. I'm like, where is this really all going? What are we really leaning towards? But all I will say is stick to the end. Stick to the very end, and the way this all does wrap up together, I really do think they gave this show the time it needed to flesh out these characters, to really tell this story, let everything breathe in a way that made a lot of sense for this show. I think if we were to go on from here, there just isn't really a reason to. I think we get the most mileage out of all these characters. We got the most mileage out of these stories. And I think as a result, the show is that much more satisfying. The ending especially is easily one of the most just beautiful endings I've seen in a very long time. I couldn't think of a more fitting way to wrap this up than the way they really did. And so many scenes within that finale were just so utterly satisfying to watch. And I'll talk more about when we get into the spoilers. But I think at the end of the day, when it comes down to the editing, I think the show was perfectly paced in that way. It should also be worth noting, the story that is presented here, it's very much done in a non-linear structure, and again, that's a big similarity to, like, The Leftovers in that way, and I honestly think the story is more effective. I've seen some people say that it doesn't work for this show, and that it would be a lot better if it was told in a more coherent manner, but I would very much disagree, because I think there are certain details that, if we knew it early on, would lessen the impact of later events in the story. So I think knowing things when we did, because it takes, for a while when it comes to the flashbacks, they're kind of telling us things at an arm's length. We have an idea of what's going on, but we're not entirely sure what happened, and eventually we get more into, like, the nitty-gritty of it all. I think it's that much more satisfying because it felt like there was this buildup, there was this mystery, and I think if it wasn't told in this way, there isn't really that much of a mystery, and I think, having that in this show, I think that's what really, like, latches you onto a lot of what's going on here. So I would, like, vehemently disagree that this show doesn't work in a nonlinear structure. I actually think it enhances a lot of the storytelling overall. Alright, so with all of that, we are going to dive into spoilers here, which, oh my god, there is so much to talk about in terms of spoilers. I really don't know where to begin. I think I'll just go from, like, smaller stuff to bigger stuff. So I'm going to start off with the character of Miranda. Throughout a lot of the show, you're trying to figure out what is her purpose. What is she really all about? Turns out she's the person who wrote Station 11, which Station 11 very much works. And the reason I didn't really bring it up in this video is because I don't really want to, get into the whole how Station 11 is sort of like this blueprint for a lot of the characters' actions in the show. Station 11 is sort of this, comforting sort of text for characters like Kirsten, eventually other characters in the show, but in that way, I think Miranda becomes maybe one of the most important characters because she goes on to write something that is going to change history. It's going to be around for decades. Like, yeah, Miranda dies, tragically, obviously, during this pandemic, but her legacy really does live on in a very big way, and I really did love that when it came to her character. For someone who was befallen to this tragedy that, her family died, and she kind of used Station 11 as, like, a coping mechanism to really, like, help her through that, and she became so buried in her work because of it. That's all that really mattered to her. Her relationship with Arthur, while you could tell that she generally cared about that relationship and wanted to make it work, she was too married to her work to really put in that effort. And I think that in contrast, Arthur as a character is very interesting because he's someone who, hasn't been in anything noteworthy. He's done a lot of, like, movies that he just isn't a fan of. He's clearly just doing it because he wants work. That's really all he cares about. And so the second he gets a chance to do something serious, unfortunately, he ends up passing away on the stage, and it's really tragic to think about. But what I think is most important when it comes to Arthur is the impact that he really did have on everyone. This was Miranda's true love. This is someone that Miranda generally did care about. I think his true love was also Miranda in that way. They did have a good relationship for a while. It just didn't really work out. And so I really do like what the show does with Miranda, where she's not really a character that becomes a better version of herself. She was dedicated to her work. This is something that she very much focused on, and she was at peace with dying, knowing that she had completed it. She was at peace with knowing that, you know, she did what she needed to do. She looked at Station 11 as her life's work, and that's what mattered to her. And I think overall that makes the character very beautiful in that way. And I really love the way that this show portrays Miranda Carroll. The fact that she dedicated her life to writing this comic book that goes on to inspire so many different generations, you know, that's why Miranda, I think, really does have this glimmer of hope in her, and I think that's something that the show does do a really excellent job with. So I really did love what we end up getting with that character overall, and I think that she was definitely someone I very much found myself attached to. But she also is the character that perhaps feels the most guilt about everything that's happened, because she was so buried in her work. She comes to realization that, you know, she didn't get to see Arthur in those final moments. She had an opportunity to go to that play and decided to go to work. And my God, Danielle Deadwyler's work in that scene was just absolutely incredible. You can see just how much pain she's in, how much anguish she's in, wishing that she could have made things work differently, wishing that her final conversation with Arthur was something different and not him, you know, kind of lashing out at her about, you know, and not him lashing out at her about, you know, this work, like, destroying the both of them. You know, it's a really sad to think about, but I think they did some really excellent work when it came to that character, and I think once we get down to the finale, which I will talk about, I think her character was that much more satisfying. So she definitely ended up becoming one of my favorite characters by the end of this. The next part I want to talk about is everything going on with the character of Clark, because he's a character that also I thought was very interesting. I don't think he's a character that for the majority of the show is that likable. He's someone that is inherently selfish in that way, because he didn't have a great relationship with Arthur. Yes, they were friends, but Clark felt like he was kind of like in Arthur's shadow a lot of the time. He didn't really get the work that Arthur did. Nobody really knew who he was. He had a friendship with Miranda, but that kind of fell out when Miranda and Arthur broke up, and he kind of like wants that back and wishes they had that connection again. And so he's not exactly the most likable character. I mean, the last thing he says to Arthur before Arthur dies is that Arthur is like a horrible father to Tyler. That's the last thing he says to him. And you can see how much that really does affect him, and why Elizabeth is so upset with him when they first enter that airport. You know, you understand why she feels that way, which we'll get into Elizabeth in a little bit, but I want to focus mainly on Clark. I think what the show did a really great job with when it came to his character is making him likable, getting you to understand his point of view. When he enters this airport, you know, he finally sees an opportunity to sort of be the hero of his own story. That's what he's always wanted to be. He wants to be someone that gets some recognition. He wants to be someone that people see in a positive light. Even though he has these very toxic behaviors where it's like his way or the highway, you know, you see he's able to restore this airport and make it this safe haven of sorts. He constructs the whole thing. He makes the museum. He's able to turn things around, and it's really great to see what he ends up doing, but he still has a lot of past demons. There's a lot of unresolved stuff between him and Elizabeth. There's a lot of unresolved tension between him and Tyler. Tyler never really forgives him for this, you can see, and this really does have a pretty big impact on Clark as a result. And I would go as far as to say Clark is a secondary villain in this show, definitely. I don't think the show necessarily has like a villain or a hero by the end of it. I don't think anyone is inherently good or inherently bad in this show. But if I had to say, like, yeah, this is an antagonist, I would say Clark is very much one of them, because he's someone that is always fearing the worst out of people. You know, he constantly believes, like, it's still really bad out there. We can't leave this airport, even though you can tell Elizabeth wants to, everyone else wants to. Like, he's so fixated on that. He cares about this museum, which you can tell nobody else really does. And it's because he wants that credit. He wants, you know, that desire that he never really received ever. You know, he's someone who kind of comes out of the pandemic completely unsatisfied with who he is, and now feels a lot more fulfilled, feels like he's gotten that gratification, and I think that character is really well done. But you can see there is still this sort of bitterness that Clark has because he hasn't gotten through the past. There's a lot of scars that are there, and we start to see more of what happened. He had a very contentious friendship with Arthur by the end, very jealous of his success, not really wanting him to pursue these things. He had a friendship with Miranda that kind of fell out, and you can see that this is stuff that has very much affected him in that way. But most of all, he has a very volatile relationship when it comes to Tyler, and I think that's something that the show dives into very well. And contrasting that with Elizabeth, who had way more to do in the show than I expected, I really liked her character a lot. She's someone who kind of feels like everything's kind of happening for a reason. She's very overprotective of Tyler. She doesn't really let him do the things that he wants to do, and this causes him to obviously rebel. And you can see that Elizabeth really does kind of guilt herself for why Tyler makes the choices that he really does. And I really liked what they did with that character a lot. Like I said, I thought they gave her a lot more to do than I expected. But of course, we got to get to Tyler as a character. What an interesting character this really was, because he starts off in the show and you think that he is like this psychopath, and from the second that like Daniel enters, like there's something off about him. When Kirsten stabs him, like, again, as much as that does kind of like, cause everything to just get a lot more chaotic, you understand her reasoning for doing that because you're just as wary of him. You're like, oh my god, this guy's clearly up to no good. And when we eventually discover that Daniel is Tyler, it just made that much more sense. Everything clicked that much more. This is someone who is so deeply hurt by the past that he wants to kind of just forget about it entirely. He wants to pretend it doesn't happen, let the past die, if you will. That's very much what he's all about. He is very much trying to just shut it all down and just move forward. And the way he wants to do that is just burn everything. He uses a lot of kids that haven't been exposed to anything that went down in the past as sort of like his underlings of sorts, and it's really fucked up at first when he's strapping these bombs to like their chest and he ends up killing Gil, which was insane to see when David Cross's character just dies like that. I did not expect him to die in the way that he did. I thought that they were going to keep him around for a bit, but no, he dies literally right at the end of that episode, which was crazy to see. But you can see that Tyler's entire goal is to just burn everything and move forward. He doesn't believe that the past is important. He wants to just kind of like move past it. And that's what really draws him to Kirsten as a character. And I really did like that a lot, that they go from Tyler being someone that could potentially be this very dangerous adversary to actually the person I think Kirsten understands the most out of everyone, because similar to Kirsten, he remembers life before the pandemic. He remembers what life used to be, but he also has a lot of trauma that he went through, similar to Kirsten, and I think that really does bring these two together. I've seen a lot of people say, why does Kirsten feel so inclined to constantly talk to Tyler? Why does she feel this connection towards him? And I think what it really does come down to is that these two share something, and that's not just their love for Station 11, which we find out Tyler has also been exposed to. He's the only other person that has a copy of it in the world. But it's the fact that they have this shared trauma in that way. They both have some very painful memories and a lot of pent-up anger, a lot of pent-up frustration, and you can really see that connection. It became one of my favorite parts of the entire show. I love the back and forth between these two. I love how he really does become this sort of like, Kirsten kind of becomes this person that's going to rehabilitate him, that becomes sort of like his therapist in a way. I really like the bonding that these two ended up having. It was such an unexpected direction to take that character in, but it made so much sense. And for a while, you think maybe he's going to turn things around. Maybe he's going to get back on a better path. But then he does end up destroying the museum, and it seems like he's, going to go down a really dark path. But of course, we'll talk about what ends up happening really within that finale. But I really love what they did with this character. Like I said, he could have easily been someone that was very one-note, but you understand why he is so upset. He's mad at Clark. He resents Elizabeth. He doesn't want anything to do with either of them. He's trying to stray as far away from that part of his life as possible. and you can see that it's just taken him down such a relentless, it's such a relentless direction. And I think overall they did some really great work when it came to him as a character. But the way he also pulls in Alex, who Alex is someone that I really found myself intrigued by, because Alex is the polar opposite of Kirsten in the sense where she has no memory of the past whatsoever. She was born before, she was born after the pandemic had occurred, so she doesn't understand how a lot of this stuff works, but it also causes the Traveling Symphony to still treat her like a child. And when they first enter, and, the Traveling Symphony ends up getting captured by the bandanas and the people in Tyler's crew, and they end up in the airport, while a lot of them very much, while you can see that people like Kirsten just want to get out of there, someone like Alex is so entranced by all this stuff because she's never seen technology like this before. She's never seen a society quite like this, and this is something that she's very intrigued by. She wants to stay there, and I really love that about Alex's character. She's someone who you really don't think about in this scenario, where it's like, imagine a world where someone didn't know about technology, someone didn't know about all this other stuff that we had access to. That's not something that Alex was privy to, and I really like seeing Alex sort of rediscovering all of that and becoming her own person. I found her to be a very interesting character in that way, so I really love what they end up doing with her in the show. But of course, the majority of the stuff I'm going to talk about is everything going on with Jeevan and Kirsten and Frank, which, like I said, I think when it really comes down to it, this is the heart of the show. These two, Jeevan and Kirsten especially, really do tug at the heartstrings in a very big way. But just getting into it, I mean, we know from the beginning that something occurs that causes Kirsten to venture away from Jeevan and Frank, because obviously in the present day they're not around. We know that she eventually has to fend for herself. The whole point is, how does she really end up getting there? And I think the show did it in a very interesting way, where we see for a while she's actually bonding a lot more with Frank. These two really do open up to each other. He shares her love for art. He has that sort of optimistic attitude. He wants to move forward with her play, while Jeevan, on the other hand, is very agitated by a lot of this stuff. And I think what the show really is trying to shed a light on is that while Jeevan wants to be the guardian to Kirsten, he didn't really know how to do that. He doesn't know what it's like to be a father. He didn't have much direction in his life, and I like that the show dives into that idea that Kirsten starts off as someone he wants to look forward to, he wants to look after, but very quickly kind of becomes this annoyance towards him, someone that he doesn't really know how to care for. What really does keep him in that apartment is his relationship with Frank. And Frank I found to be a very intriguing character, and he has a very interesting perspective during this whole pandemic. While a lot of these characters are trying to get out of this, Frank kind of just wants to live in the moment. He's trying to write this biography. He's had an injury from the war that's kind of made him very reclusive in that way. So he very much enjoys this life. He wants to stay in this apartment for as long as possible. He's really trying to ride it out, and he finds things to do. And this did seem very relatable. It's like those early days where everyone was saying when we were in lockdown and everyone was saying find something to do that drives you in a creative manner. That's everything that Frank is doing here. He becomes this teacher to Kirsten. He's someone that gets very close with her. He really likes the idea of her play and things like that. And I really liked what they ended up doing with Frank in this show, where he is someone that has a lot of trauma because of what he's been through. But again, what ties him to living is just the idea of Jeevan and Kirsten. He wants them around for as long as possible. I really liked what they ended up doing with him, but eventually, that is going to get the worst of him, because Jeevan and Kirsten realize that they can't live here much longer. They don't have many food. They don't have a lot of food left. It's not habitable. And eventually someone does try to break into that apartment. Frank decides to stay. He doesn't want to leave. He wants to stay in this apartment because he feels like he's done his work. He feels like he's done everything he's accomplished in life. He doesn't really know what else he wants to do. He's written that biography. He doesn't really have much left, and the moment where he does decide to sacrifice himself, it's heartbreaking to watch, but it made so much sense for him as a character. So I think they did some really great work when it came to Frank, more than you really would expect. And I think that he ended up becoming one of my favorite characters in the show. I really liked what they ended up doing with him overall. But the episode with Jeevan really does give us a lot of context into what really happens between him and Kirsten. Because I think what the show really does get at is that while Jeevan couldn't be this surrogate father to Kirsten that he really wanted, Kirsten gave him a sense of purpose that he otherwise would not have had. But it's the idea that Jeevan, couldn't be this surrogate father to Kirsten. He wanted to be, but yet she still gave him this sense of purpose. He does abandon her eventually in the woods, which is a dick move for sure. Like, when we found out that happened, it makes sense why Kirsten is so, traumatized by the events of what happened there. Because I thought Jeevan died. Like, that's what I thought they were leading towards. I thought Jeevan ended up dying, and when he got attacked by, that wolf or whatever, that he was just gonna end up dying there, and that she would then have to go off and fend for herself. But I like the result of what happened a lot more, actually. I like the idea that he's taken in by these nurses who they need another doctor, and he's not a doctor, but he has the skills. He knows how a doctor should be because his sister was a doctor, but you're not entirely sure if he has the skills to really become one. But eventually he does decide to stick it out, and he does end up successfully, birthing a bunch of he does end up successfully delivering a bunch of babies. And it's a really great moment for Jeevan because he finally does have that purpose. You get the sense early on the show, when he's going up to Arthur, straight up trying to save him, even though he doesn't know any of that stuff. He doesn't have the proper training. He wants to be this hero. He wants to be the savior. And finally, he's able to do that. And it's such a great moment. And again, Himesh Patel was just so incredible throughout this entire episode. I mean, when he's haunted by Frank, and you can see that Frank is constantly, he's kind of jealous of Frank because Frank had a better relationship with Kirsten and Jeevan didn't, and Kirsten's become this annoyance of sorts to the point where he just doesn't think he can care for her anymore. She needs more kids her age, he needs more adults his age. He can't really do it. He's gotten to the point where he just can't stand living with her. But he's able to venture off. He's able to find that purpose elsewhere. He has a whole new family of his own. It's a really great arc for his character that I really didn't think they were going towards that way. I thought Jeevan was doomed to failure. But again, this show finds a way to go in a very hopeful direction for that character. And that's something that I really did love overall when it came to him. But of course, getting down to Kirsten, this really does fill in so many blocks for this character. It gets us to understand a lot of what Kirsten's all about in the present day. Why is she constantly, in fear that something bad is going to happen? Why does she always carry a knife on her? Why is she always in such distress? Why, when people want to join the traveling symphony, is she very wary of them, and things like that? We finally get to understand that here because she's had encounters before, whether it's that guy breaking into that house, and you can tell that that's left a visible scar on her. It left a pretty big impact on her. With Frank, with Jeevan having to fight that man and Frank being attacked and Frank eventually dying from that. That really affecting her in a big way. Her having to go off in the woods all by herself without Jeevan. You can see this as something that has very much affected her. But what keeps her sane and what really does keep her, a little bit more optimistic than a lot of these other characters is that comic book, is Station 11. It gives her this sense of purpose. It gives her this sense of renowned joy that she otherwise doesn't have. And seeing her kind of share that with everyone and her becoming part of this theater troupe and sharing her love for art, it's just really beautiful to watch. And I think that's something that is exhumed so well by both versions of Kirsten, even though Mackenzie Davis's version is, again, a lot more pessimistic at points where she's worried of the worst possible things. She's so she's so frightened by what could potentially happen to characters like Alex. She still cares so much about this theater troupe. They've become this family of hers, and it's really great to see, what ended up happening. And also, going back to Alex, I love the fact that Jeevan is basically the reason that Alex ended up at the theater troupe, because Alex's mother was going to venture off with her, and Jeevan said it's probably best to leave her because she'll be safer. And it turns out he was right, and Alex is now part of the theater troupe, and she is better than she really could have ever been. And it's really amazing to see that journey. So I think the show actually filled in those gaps quite well. And like I said, I think if we were to get a linear story, yeah, it would be somewhat satisfying, but there'd be a lot of things that we just didn't really have much mystery about. Like, why does Kirsten carry a knife? Why is Kirsten so protective of Alex? Why is Kirsten singled out as someone who is much more, traumatized by a lot of what's going on? Why is she so much more affected by a presence like Daniel than everyone else in the Traveling Symphony? It makes a lot more sense when you tie all of these things together, when you actually get to see things play out in the way that they do. I think it's that much more gratifying of an experience overall. So I like the fact that the show really took its time to explore everything. I like the fact that the show didn't try to just present everything at once. I think if they would have done it in a linear manner, I think, again, yes, it would have given us a bit more context, but I just think that the mystery is so much more powerful, and I really like the way they ended up telling the story in the show. Of course, now I do want to dive deeper into the finale, which, like I said before, I think is legitimately perfect. It is one of the most satisfying and utterly just beautiful finales I've seen in a very long time. I cried many times throughout this episode, I'm not gonna lie to you. Starting off with the flashbacks with Miranda, this is probably one of the most prominent, moments we've gotten in terms of that, where we knew from the beginning that Miranda had this tragedy, obviously with her entire family perishing, but we didn't really know what happened. Turns out her entire family died in this hurricane, and she was the one standing on the counter, she was standing on this counter drawing, and that's what kind of kept her alive. And since then, she's kind of, coped with that through making Station 11. And when she gets word that, her friends are on this plane and they're going to be deplaned and things like that, she thinks the worst out of everyone, and she gets this call from Clark, realizes what's going on, and basically tells the other plane that they basically calls the person that's on, she calls the pilot and tells him that he needs to keep everyone on that plane because they are going to have to die on that plane. And if he lets them into the airport, it's going to cause way more casualties. And so Miranda really does become a big hero in that way. It makes sense why that pilot, why we see in episode 1 that plane just like crashing down on its own. Again, it really was because Miranda sprung into action and saved a bunch of people's lives within that airport. It's why Clark and Elizabeth and Tyler were able to enjoy their livelihood and able to create this life for themselves. It really was because of Miranda, and it's this really amazing moment, and everything just kind of clicks at that point where you realize just how important Miranda is, not just creating the blueprint for a lot of these characters, but also really becoming the unexpected hero of the story. And I really did love that a lot. And I think Miranda mirrors Kirsten in a pretty big way. Both of these characters are very much dedicated to their work, but also have a personal connection to Station 11 in that way. For Kirsten, it's the idea that Station 11 is the thing that kept her sane. It's the thing that kind of kept her through all of this when her parents died and things like that. Which was such a tragic moment, by the way, when she's in that apartment and she gets that call and we find out that her mother has has died, and her father probably is on his way to die soon as well. Station 11 is really that thing that keeps her grounded. She decides to write an entire play about it to really, again, as like this coping mechanism to move forward, to not dwell on the things that are eventually going to happen. She knows they're eventually going to get there, but she wants to focus on that creative expression. And I really love how Kirsten finds a way to make art be this thing. And I really like how in this finale, Kirsten kind of becomes this savior of sorts, where she repairs all kinds of different relationships. When it comes to Elizabeth, someone that's like very steadfast in the idea that like they have to stay here, this is their only place of existence. She kind of develops this warm soul when she realizes that she could make amends with her son. That's like the one thing she really wants, even if it seems kind of impossible. She wants it to happen. When Kirsten presents Station 11 to Clark, and he realizes that she has a connection to Miranda, someone that he wishes he had a better relationship with. It really gets him in that moment when she talks about Arthur and how Arthur was this mentor of sorts to her and how much Arthur cared about her. It's a really amazing moment when it all just kind of clicks in for Clark, and he goes from being someone that's very like cold-hearted and standoffish to someone that is a lot more open to Kirsten's ideas. Elizabeth is no longer running the show like she was before. Now she lets Kirsten direct, and it's such an amazing moment when she gets to Tyler, and Tyler he's very volatile. He has all of these talks of ending things, but Kirsten brings up to him the connection that they have to Station 11 and things like that, and this gives him a chance to repair things with Elizabeth and Clark. He finally forgives Clark in that performance, which these are the scenes that really got to me. When he forgave Clark, and Clark talked about how much Arthur really did love him and things like that. I thought was a really great moment. And then when he finally gets to Elizabeth and finally accepts her as his mother, something he's never really done before. Such an amazing moment with what they ended up doing with that character. But then talking about someone like Alex, for example, I like that Alex is willing to stick around the airport because she likes the idea of this civilization. It's something that she's never really seen before. She wants to venture off. She wants to be more independent. And I like that Kirsten, for the first time, is okay with it. She tells her, yeah, you can go ahead and do that. She isn't as protective of her because she realizes there isn't as much to worry about. These characters can become whole again. These people can become better versions of themselves. She's seen it happen. And now she's okay with Alex venturing off and becoming a part of this civilization for a bit. She trusts Tyler. She trusts these people. It's a really amazing moment when she reaches out to that little girl who is just so, you can see, again, been so brainwashed by Tyler that things need to be a certain way, that, they need to burn everything to the ground. And Kirsten actually opens her up to the ideas that, like, these come from Station 11, and she lets her read the comic book, and the little girl becomes, like, obsessed with it. It's all just so good. I love so much of the storytelling going on here. There's so much that Kirsten is able to do, and she herself goes through such a great arc where she's no longer as fearful. She's now more accepting to the world. She recognizes that, the world can become better again. It might not always be, but, they add the airport to, like, the wheel and things like that. It's just so many amazing moments throughout this entire finale. When Sarah dies, that Jeevan is the one that's with her. Two people that really saved Kirsten and turned her life around for the better. It's so poetic in that way. Everything felt so satisfying. But of course, the thing we all were excited for is, are Jeevan and Kirsten going to finally meet back up? Are they going to have some close calls? And for a while, I wasn't sure if it was actually going to happen. But then when the play is going on and everyone's celebrating, and we see the Traveling Symphony is kind of like dedicating their song to Sarah, singing Sarah's favorite song, that's when it happens. And it is such a satisfying moment, because the show really did the work to get us here. It showed the individual journeys of Kirsten and Jeevan and sort of like their paths in life and how they have both had varying degrees of success. So when these two finally do meet back up, we are that much more, we understand how important this is to both these characters. And this, to me, is the thing that very much justifies the nonlinear storytelling, because we now understand the full journey of both of these characters. We understand how treacherous of a journey this has been for Kirsten, who had to fend for herself for a while, but thankfully was rescued by Sarah, someone that did turn out to be her mentor in the way that Jeevan wanted to be. And we know that Jeevan has become this doctor, and he has this whole family, and this is who he is now. And I love when these two meet back up, realizes that they both are content with the way their lives are going, and you get the sense that they probably do talk things over, but you know it's not going to be the last time that these two do see each other. And it's great because now they actually do have that resolution. Kirsten didn't know where he went for a while. She probably didn't even think he was alive for a long time. And knowing that he not only is alive, but that he's happy with his life and who he turned out to be, you can see this weight is lifted off her shoulders. All of those traumatic memories are sort of just like whisked away after this scene, and it's just it's so satisfying to watch, you know, him realizing how she's turned out, that she's now become part of this amazing community that's instilling hope within everyone and turning everyone's lives around for the better. Again, just so many amazing things going on here. I love the way all of that was constructed, and the way it leaves off with her promising that they're going to add the airport back to the wheels so she'll see him again, and then venturing off and her going back to her family and him going back to his. It's just perfect. It's such a just amazing way to wrap up this series. It's such an emotional gut punch because you want these two to reunite, you want these two to stay together, but you understand why they can't. You understand why both of them are better off by themselves. And I think the show is that much more powerful in that way. It's such a cathartic message of just because things seem terrible doesn't mean they have to stay terrible. And I think that's something that each one of these characters recognize, whether it's Tyler and him recognizing that he doesn't need to abandon the past. He just needs to learn from it. He needs to recognize the errors of his ways, but also the errors of everyone around him and move forward and not just burn it all to the ground. He needs to look at what was wrong in the past and try to correct it. And that's exactly what he's now trying to do. When you look at Clark, someone that felt like he didn't have much of a purpose and was very resentful towards these characters, now realizing that there is still memories left of Miranda. There are still memories left of Arthur. It makes him feel not as alone. It makes him feel like he does have a purpose within the world. You know, he felt like he was just going to wither and die for a while and that he wasn't really going to accomplish much. But knowing that someone like Kirsten, you know, had such a personal connection to both of these characters, it matters a lot to him. So he's able to move forward. Whether even characters that have died, like Frank, you know, Frank realized that, yes, he died, but his memory lives on. And I think that's the big part of this show, is that those memories never really do fade away. It's the things that we're able to continue carrying over from generations, art, music, comic books, Station 11, you know, that's what really is important at the end of the day. And I think that's something that the show just summed up so well, and it's such a interesting way to view things, but I really do love the hopeful nature of it. And I think, you know, especially where we are right now, I think it's such an inspiring message where it's like, yes, things kind of suck right now, but they are going to get better and they can get better. Yes, society is going to change, but there are things that we can carry over. Kirsten never got rid of Station 11, and look how much better everyone is because of it. It really did heal so many people. Miranda, yes, she wrote Station 11, and yes, she was content with dying, but she sprung to action and saved so many people. Nobody knows that she did it, but she's the unsung hero, and she changed a bunch of people's lives around for better. None of what happens in this show happens if Miranda doesn't spring to action and save Elizabeth and save Clark and save Tyler. None of this would would be able to happen if that didn't happen. If Jeevan didn't find Kirsten before she, was looking for her parents, before she left the theater, and let him, stay with him for like a year, none of this would have happened. So again, I think what the show's really trying to focus on is not dwelling on the past, but recognizing what got you here and how you can move forward as a community. I think that's such a universally timely message, and I think that's something the show just did such an amazing job of handling. And I think the finale itself, it's one of the most perfect episodes of television I've seen in a while. A lot of these episodes I think were perfect, but this episode in particular, I just can't think of a better way to wrap this up. It's just everything wrapped up in a nice, neat little bow. It was so beautiful and poignant, and I truly do not see how else this show could continue afterwards, because I think they covered all the ground they needed to, and I think it ended up being one of the most satisfying endings that I've seen to anything in quite a bit. Overall, guys, Station 11 is a show that really did blow me away in so many different areas. Yes, it does have some very dark moments. Yes, it doesn't try to pull any punches when it comes to the severity of the pandemic and the effect it has on many of the characters, but it wants to move forward. It wants to be a lot more hopeful. It wants to tell a story about art and how much that can affect people and how much people can move forward as a community. And I think, with the state that we're in, this is something that we need right now. Station 11 can be a way to heal us. It shouldn't be something that we try to just write off because, it deals with a pandemic. We should look into it, and we should see it as a way to heal ourselves and see it as a way to really show how you can move forward. I think all of that is so well done here. It's got some of the best performances of any show I've seen in a while. Mackenzie Davis, but especially Himesh Patel, really do anchor this show in terms of emotion. There are a lot of emotional gut punches in the show, but I think it is a wholly satisfying experience that is going to frustrate some people with how disjointed it can be. And to be honest, there were some points where it did, but at the end of the day, the things that are so great about the show, that really doesn't bother me that much at the end of the day. I think the way the show is constructed, I think what it ended up doing, I think especially the way it wrapped up so many of these characters, went in so many unexpected directions, I just can't help but applaud Patrick Somerville and everyone that worked on this show, for it to be the satisfying experience that it really is. It is very philosophical. It dives into some very heavy topics, but it's the kind of show that is so much more hopeful than it really you would expect it to be. It has such an interesting, it has such a beating heart to it, and it's the kind of, it's the kind of show that I don't think we see a lot of, and I'm glad that a show like this was able to come out. I know there were a lot of deviations from the book, but I think many of them were very much warranted, and overall, I think this is just one of the most wholly satisfying and emotional experiences that I have seen in any show this year or last. And with all of that said, I am absolutely going to give Station 11 an A+. I was teetering with an A for a while, I really was, but I have to say, with the way everything wrapped up and just how perfect that ending was, I really just found myself so pleased with everything when it came to the show. I cannot recommend this one enough to you guys. It's not the easiest watch at points, no, but for me it was a very easy binge. I found it incredibly riveting, and it just had such a visceral impact on me that I just can't help but recommend this one. But overall, guys, in my review of Station 11, let me know what you guys saw of the show overall, left your thoughts, and I really hope more people do get on the show. I have not heard too many people bring it up, and I can understand why, but I really do think it is worth your time for sure. I think it's probably now my favorite HBO Max show if I really had to pick one. But that's it for this video. Hope you guys enjoyed it. We'll see you guys in my next video, and we'll see you guys for that. Okay, bye.